A PhD in the sort of broader area of how we actually generate insights from data. So in part response really about the fact that a lot of the literature, as well as my experience, focuses a lot on the technology side, delivering data warehouses and so on. And the bit about having done that, how do you actually get value from it is when people actually get the insights, and that's relatively less well understood. So that's my PhD sort of research focus. You'll notice that's not necessarily about dashboards specifically, but obviously dashboards are one instance of how we might actually use data and draw some insights. So I'll explore that theme a little bit more, and there's quite a lot in it, so I'll gallop through it at a fair pace, and then hopefully take some questions at the end of that. It's also a bit of an experiment. I'm using Prezi for the first time, so hopefully that should work. Let me just a PhD in the sort of broader area of how we actually generate insights from data. So in part response really about the fact that a lot of the literature, as well as my experience, focuses a lot on the technology side, delivering data warehouses and so on. And the bit about having done that, how do you actually get value from it is when people actually get the insights, and that's relatively less well understood. So that's my PhD sort of research focus. You'll notice that's not necessarily about dashboards specifically, but obviously dashboards are one instance of how we might actually use data and draw some insights. So I'll explore that theme a little bit more, and there's quite a lot in it, so I'll gallop through it at a fair pace, and then hopefully take some questions at the end of that. It's also a bit of an experiment. I'm using Prezi for the first time, so hopefully that should work. Let me just escape that. So if we quickly have a look at, oh, it's not. It's in 10 minutes. I don't think that means I need to quit this one. So I think one of the kind of things I was really kind of thinking is what kind of metaphor do I really want to use to actually try and explain and explore the topic area. So often what comes up I think around this is this idea of a dashboard. And I think that's probably a useful starting point, is to say, well actually, what is it about? Is it about trying to get somewhere and about actually using a whole lot of measures or whatever it might be to really try and help you do that? Or is it really about trying to work out what's already happened? So there's this idea of, can we use a dashboard to really help us sort of think about that, just as a kind of metaphor for what I was looking at. If we look at, on the other hand, at how it's often talked about, both in practice as well as in academia, it's often talked about in this sort of architectural sort of viewpoint. So in other words, you've got a whole lot of transaction data, it's extracted into a data warehouse, and then you do stuff with it. Some of it about performance management, some of it about enterprise reporting, and enterprise reporting, performance measurement, that feels like it could be, quite closely connected. And then data mining, which feels quite different, really, and we'll talk about what that might look like in contrast. Okay, so if we come back to this idea of, why is it that we produce these dashboards? How are they actually used? And typically they inform management meetings or some sort of governance steering group, and this is just a kind of thought about some things that you often tend to find about meetings. Do meetings work well? So if that's the context of use, if you like, how you might actually use these things, how might this actually help you in a meeting? And do we take that into account when we actually think about designing dashboards? So if we're going to design a dashboard, we know that this is actually going to be involved in a meeting, then wouldn't you actually want to think about very carefully how does it tie into the agenda of the meeting that you're trying to deal with? So if you took an audit committee or an IT steering committee meeting, for instance, as an example, you might have a standing agenda items around, actually there's something about investment, there's something about projects running, there's something about operations and whether those are happening correctly, and then there might be some risk management and something. Is that reflected in your dashboard? Does your dashboard lead you through your agenda and help you with your agenda? In other words, do I look at this and say, well actually the top 5 risks are there, fine, that's what we'll talk about when we come to that section of the agenda. Are my operations okay? Actually, we can look at that. Yes, here are the few issues. These are the things we want to talk about. So what this then effectively does is kind of bring us to this idea that actually it's about trying to draw attention to certain things. And you'll notice quite unapologetically, I'm talking very much in social terms, in terms of use. So, what is it about this dashboard that's useful? It's about the fact that you want people in this meeting in particular, if that's the context, to start focusing on particular things that you want to talk about. And what are those things that they need to actually want to engage in? And it is going to be about what's going wrong, what do we need to decide, what are those sort of things that we actually want to actually structure and focus some time on and get input on from a range of stakeholders, whatever it might be. So if you can bear that in mind, that's quite an interesting framing for this, which is often kind of off to one side, and it's all about the dashboard by contrast. So if we then quickly go back, if that is the dashboard context of use, what could we potentially, be talking about? We talked about the attention aspect, and I think what that's trying to do is, say, well, actually, if that's the attention, what we don't want is for the meeting to be dominated by one issue or something like that, or for the largest person who has an issue because, IT fell over last week. So, all you end up talking about is the fact that you couldn't get your email access, and the rest of the governance meeting might actually not actually happen. So it's about trying to get people focused. Now, if that is about focus, then the choice of what you put in there is actually very important, because if you put too few things in there, or it's biased in one particular direction, what I've alluded to here is the fact that it's very often financial. That's where it started. A lot of dashboard reporting and management reporting was heavily financial. And the danger with that is that you're focusing everybody's attention on one dimension of whatever it is that you're trying to view. And you then get this kind of binocular sort of narrow vision. So in other words, if that's what we're focused on, that's what we get reported, then anything else doesn't really get much attention or time. One of the early sort of academic responses then to that was to say, well, actually, what should be in a dashboard? What potentially could we be looking at? And one of the things that's worth looking at is whether your business model, if you're talking about broad management information now, is properly reflected. Are all these different dimensions of your business that are important in your business model actually somehow reflected in your dashboards? That very often leads to, are there critical success factors involved in any of these different activities? Are those clear? So this is just an example, for instance, of saying, well, actually, we've looked at a value chain or a process map. We've identified what are the critical success factors for those, the key performance indicators associated with those. There's a bit of discussion there about whether you tend to look backwards and look just at lagging indicators, or whether you look at leading indicators. And often leading indicators tend to be buried in processes. So, it may be the number of sales orders that have been logged well before you actually get to a sale, for instance, or something like that. And this really just says, well, actually getting a good understanding of that's not that starting point. Also then looking at whether those actually are supported by management information systems in any way. So do you get standard reports on each of these KPIs? And certainly when we did this exercise, we discovered, if you look at the ticks and the crosses on the other side, that actually most of them weren't necessarily even reported. So you didn't even have the data supporting that. What that does lead to is very often, if it's considered important, is that you'll tend to, if you're not getting that from your formal systems, is to come up with some sort of end-user solution to try and cobble together that kind of information. Along similar lines, you can also take a value chain view. So there's the business model view that might be useful. There's the value chain view, which is slightly more integrated, perhaps, and more step-by-step. But that's another sort of contribution that might be worth thinking through, whether you've got all those dimensions covered. That's still very much within an organization. So if you then step out and say, well, actually, we exist in a bit of an ecosystem, so actually everything that we should be looking at from a business perspective isn't just what's internal to us. It's where do we lie within an overall value chain or a value ecosystem and so on, and how do you draw that? So where are we? And I think what some of the software industry are very good at is saying, well, who's extracting the overall value add that's inherent in that kind of value ecosystem? And that doesn't happen, evenly. So, you've got lots of jostling there about, who in this value chain extracts the most value, and why is that? Why are they powerful in that particular value chain? And the ideas of porters find forces might help inform, what it is that's important there to actually keep track of. Okay. So those are just some examples of different ways you can draw that. It gets quite visual. You can decide to do different tooling to support that, or also just you can actually decide where you are in terms of red, amber, green versus various forms of visual analysis and dependency flows there about what's actually happening. One of the sort of academic responses very early to this incredibly narrow focus on financial information was to actually say, you need to look at other dimensions. And very early on in, I think, certainly dashboard reporting, you've got some of these ideas of balanced scorecard coming in. In other words, you need to have lots of different dimensions, the financial being only one. And that's been around for some time, and I think that's certainly reflected a lot, I think, in some of the dashboarding that we're seeing. What is interesting there, though, is to say, well, actually, that's about the what question. What should you actually add in there? But if you actually think about the other aspect is much more the social side of, well, what do you do with that? Getting back to the use context again. So even those dashboards that we talked about around the balanced scorecard, if you actually read up in the literature that they published, the real benefit there was not specifically just what measures it was that you decided on. It's how they related to each other. And in fact, the exploration process of actually taking your management group or your middle management group through that process of identifying what is critical, how does this relate to an overall outcome or whatever it is that we might be, why is it that we need to look at some of these people measures and the process measures? How does that impact on some of the other measures that we think are important? So it's very much about getting this holistic, interconnected understanding of these measures rather than, we just need to measure all the, we need to track all those measures, or different functions need to track different measures without really understanding how they interrelate. So what they emphasized there was the shared understanding that comes through a process of exploring that and coming up with your measures. So they were much more about the fact that it was the process of establishing this where the value lay. And the value lay very much in the learning that occurred rather than just in getting to an answer. So the danger there, for instance, is if you get a consultant in, they've done this a million times, you get a fantastic dashboard, but actually you don't necessarily get that underlying understanding unless people have really engaged with what it is that they're measuring and how they interconnect and how they need to use it properly. Okay. And that idea of a value map where you show those interconnections is something that's used very well in the communication of those ideas. If we then just look at what dashboards look like, I mean, there's quite a lot of stuff which is, they're very visual. They typically tend to be very short, sharp, 1 pages, maybe 2 pages, things like that. So there's a lot of competition there about, well, how do you design these things visually? And you can see that that is open to huge amounts of variation in interpretation, all the way through from graphs and things that are fairly sort of traditional through to quite novel, sort of artistic, sort of creative ways of doing it. But again, that requires quite a lot of thought. It's not just something that you arrive at with an IT sort of saying, well, we've got this data, how do we just present that? That requires quite a lot of thought to get to something which is really rich and meaningful and very easily accessible for users. If you then also think about some of the aspects that make it a bit more interactive or so on, is the fact that there's this idea of tolerances or scale. In other words, what might be appropriate for your middle manager might be a lot more detailed than what's actually appropriate for your senior manager. There's something about the fact that if you've identified an issue in a certain area, you need to anticipate the fact that there's going to be a follow-up question. So even at the senior level, if you've identified a red light on the dashboard, one of the first questions in that meeting is going to be, well, what's happened? There's going to be a need for more information around that. So how do you actually help that? Or in other words, some things might also only come into focus at different granularities, or if you change the tolerances. If everything's green, then is that because everything is green, or is that just because your tolerances are such that you're not picking up on any exceptions because you've actually set the bar too low? So there are those kinds of things which come up in users' minds. And how flexible is any kind of dashboarding that we do in trying to pick up that kind of turning the knob and seeing whether that actually changes? Do we develop that kind of functionality into our dashboard? I haven't seen that done very often, where you can actually say, well, actually, if I make the tolerances a little bit higher, a little bit lower, does the picture change? Or do you leave that to some sort of group that prepare these packs to do that kind of analysis and see whether those sort of things change? So this idea of trying to make your dashboard configurable, really, is an interesting way of making it certainly more interactive for users, if that's a requirement. If we then sort of say, well, actually, what else could go wrong, or what other biases could there be inherent in some of the ways in which we do this? We've talked about the fact that a lot of the information we look at, because it comes from transaction systems, is actually quite backward-looking. And that was one of the first starting points about, well, actually, do you move from lagging indicators and outcome indicators to more leading indicators? And what's the balance of leading versus lagging indicators that you've got? If you're in a fast-moving business or sector where you really need to know what's happening, then maybe you need more leading indicators than lagging indicators. So those kind of choices are very important. There's also something about thinking outside of the box. You know, we talked about the fact that you could be very internally focused because that's the data that you have. So it's easy to do this part of it, which is, you know, take your transaction data and come up with it. Much more challenging to actually say, well, actually, the really critical thing is, did we make an impact with that marketing initiative, and have we grabbed market share? You know, market share data, on the other hand, that should need to go outside the organization to do. If you want to kind of find out whether your users are happy, maybe you need to do some sentiment analysis using some Facebook type data or whatever it might be. And that external data availability, that picture has changed significantly since a lot of the initial dashboard thinking was done. You know, so it's much more possible now to get some external data feeds. Often those are messy, you know, often those are unstructured. So it's a different kind of data as well that you'd be using, and probably a lot more thought would need to go into how you present that data to make it meaningful and accessible. Okay, but challenging, but just to make sure that you're not just trapped by traditional backward-looking data. If we now start saying, well, actually, if it's about what kind of inferences you want to draw from this data. Part of it very clearly is to find out whether you are performing as expected against plan, or whatever it might be. Part of it may, if you start looking outside and so on, is to actually start seeing trends. What are other people doing? What are competitors doing? Where are the potential you know, innovators that might disrupt our industry? You know, those kinds of questions are much more exploratory. And you don't know where some of those innovations necessarily would come from, especially in the fast-moving sort of sectors, technology sectors and so on. So the question there is that actually the map of what it is that you might want to measure and might want to know is much less clear. It's not a settled matter that actually, in order to run a plant, these are the things that can go wrong, these are the things you really need to keep track of. In terms of, you know, social trends and all that sort of stuff, they could come from a million different areas. Often these micro-trends don't necessarily all end up being earth-shattering changes, but how do you sift through that? And if you don't quite know what it is that you're going to try and track, the maps might not be great. So where do you look for that information? Do you just go and look at what your competitors are doing, in which case you're doing a following exercise? If their map isn't any good, well, you're using the same map, the same brain, whatever it might be. If you think this is a completely new market, a completely new trend, or whatever it might be, the chances are that it isn't well mapped. So there's almost first an exploratory mapping process that you might need to actually go through to learn what it is about this thing that you need to measure. Okay. So anybody going into the social media space, if you want to do some tracking of social media trends, I mean, what's relevant? What's really important? You know, that's not a settled question by any stretch of the imagination, even for people who are sort of actively engaged in that sort of area. Okay. If we then also have a quick look at another way that you can actually look at exploration and so on is, again, there's this question of what dimensions are relevant about a particular area that you're trying to look at. And one of the very big developments, I think, in this space has been this idea of geographical information systems. As a data type in its own right, and the ability to actually suddenly add location data dimensions to quite a lot of data that we've traditionally captured, gives you a whole new route into data, which is very, very well worth looking at. Just as an example, I mean, the Crossrail sort of area, they've created a digital asset very much in 3 dimensions, which ties in a lot of information, which gives you all sorts of possibilities of actually throwing up heat maps. You know, again, the data is there potentially, but being thrown up in a different way. It's a different route for people, much more intuitive potentially, to say, well, actually, how's my bit of this broader picture actually dealing with? And it could be a map, it could be a rich picture that joins up the different bits of the business. But again, this idea of visually as a route in and an interaction tool, but B, the fact that you might want to switch certain layers on and off. So looking at the same sort of thing, but actually now let's look at it from an HR perspective. Now let's look at it from and doing build-ups and things again. So some very interesting ideas about what you could do. Of course, you're into three-dimensional sort of processing, which has challenges, but there are increasingly lots of tools that actually help you with that. Okay, so if you think about creative cartography as just as a metaphor, there are quite a few things, and these are some of the examples of what you could do. And there's a whole range of different ways that you could make this interesting. One caution, though, is they're very easily digestible. Senior managers and so on really find this a fantastic way of actually trying to deal with data rather than columns and more traditional metrics. But they do take quite a lot of thought, and they take quite a lot of design effort, and often quite a bit of creative input as well. So it definitely does mean that it works well. What's also worth thinking about here is what are you trying to do? Because when you step more into the exploratory space, often this is a way of exploring data, and you're exploring it visually in a way that you are relying on the user really to see patterns. You're relying on the user to actually go into this and actually say, well, actually, that looks odd. I wonder why that is. As opposed to other forms of data mining, which is much more about you put a tool, an algorithm in place, and you tell me what the answer is. You tell me what the strange anomalies are, and so on. And then a lot of that logic about what the tolerances are, what defines an exception, all the rest of it is kind of hidden away in the logic, which means your data scientist that often you might involve has a good idea of what it's telling you, but you as an intuitive user can't really make that exploration for yourself. So the question here is, when do you use this kind of exploration? When is it more appropriate to use a statistician or something like that to actually try and throw some light on things? Okay. One resource that is always worth looking at is just this specific sort of focus on trying to show up information in new and interesting ways. There's a source book in its own right. It's published as a book, but there's also an online site that's actually really interesting to look at for ideas in that space. But again, you're looking at potentially trying to explore data and trying to get some creative sort of insights into how you might do that best. If we now have a look a bit more closely at this data mining, data insights area, as opposed to the performance area, it's very much this idea that actually there's just loads more data available. We've talked about geographic data, we've talked about social media data, and a lot of this data is actually often available both inside the organization through new sensor techniques, new sensor technologies, and so on. RFIDs coming into play there, mobile phones with location data. There's just a huge amount of new possibility, but how do you best use that to get some insights? The area that is probably been engaged with this for longest, if you look at certainly the academic literature, is probably the retail industry, and this idea of marketing looking at customer analytics and so on. So that's the model that I've popped in here, and that's what's very interesting if you look at that model is just to show you what the academic focus has been to date, as well as the practitioner focus. It's all been about what kind of data, where do you get it from, what do we do with it in terms of processing, and how do we present it, in business and in business intelligence terms. Now that's a very kind of what I would call technical view of the world. It's about processing. It's about traditional IT processing models as inputs, processes, and outputs. What's missing in that, if you look at it, it's got visualization, it's got web mining, text mining, all the rest of it is the people side of it. There's not a person on that diagram which you kind of think, well, actually, how do people feature in this? They're the ones that are going to have to draw the insights. They're the ones that are going to have to decide what's relevant at the design stage. And yet they're not actually reflected in much about thinking about how to do this particularly well. So looking at that as an issue, you can do a couple of things. I've just thrown up the IBM sort of maturity models, because the first thing you might ask is, well, actually, what is everyone else doing? And to some extent, they do a bit of research there around what are the typical data mining topics that are coming up now from others. So people who are doing this very well, what are they focusing on? And there are lots of things there about pricing, there's branding, lead generation, logistics, distribution management, and they show a change over time. So in a sense, you know, is this just a question that we're taking a lens, which is big data or whatever it is, and we're pointing it in different directions, depending on what's actually informing where it is that we're directing our attention? Is that just the concern of senior management at the moment that this is where the problems are in an organization? This is the bit that we just don't have any data and we feel that we're in them? Or is there really something which is quite well thought through in terms of what's really important from our strategic perspective? And the ideas of things like, you know, what kind of information asymmetries are we actually trading on in our business model, or are really important to our business model? Is it about the fact that we really need to understand our customers better than any of our competitors? Is it about the fact that we need to understand the production process better than any of our competitors? And that's much more of a knowledge management view of the world than a traditional just key metrics perspective. So the danger, I think, with a lot of these is that you either fall into the trap of doing what everyone else is doing, often in sectors where they've got very different business models, very different challenges, but it's a fashion-driven thing. Oh, we need a bit of that because the CEO's been off to a conference and that looks like it could be really interesting. Otherwise, you may also look at maturity models coming through from vendors. Now, the danger there is the fact that in any of those, I think we're still very much in the foothills in the journey around what we're going to do with big data and all these new data types. So are we really ready at this stage to draw a maturity map when I don't think that anybody's, you know, very mature in this particular space? So the challenges are that those might be drawn very much based on early thinking, very early success stories, very limited success stories in particular areas, rather than a really broad-based understanding of what does maturity look like. Also, the other danger is they're often tied to product group maps. So in other words, to get to the next stage of maturity, you need this product. And again, this product-led thinking, or we'll have one of those then, because that's going to help us. But does that really help you with how you're going to use it and whether it's the right tool for what you're really trying to establish? Those are some of the dangers, I think, in that thinking. So if we look at the academic area, you know, which areas actually are concerned with this idea of generating new insights, if you like, or new knowledge, if you think about it that way? There's, at the very, very sort of individual level, there's this idea of how do we process data, sensory data, cognition, whatever it might be, there's that. Those are some of the things that have been driving trends towards visualization and so on. But that gets very technical and quite psychological. There's lots of bias type thinking there in terms of the new Kahneman book, I think, about thinking fast, thinking slow, is very much in that territory and quite an interesting read. You've got the traditional IS view, which we've talked about a bit already in terms of, you know, how we see things from an input processing transaction view of the world, if you like. Knowledge management. Now, there are two strands in knowledge management. One has been very much the traditional, it's about portals and putting knowledge up there and people retrieving it and so on. The other one has been very much more focused on how do we actually generate new knowledge. And a recognition in that strand of the literature that it's much more social. You know, we learn through communities of practice, we learn through interactions and dialogue. You know, it's an exploratory process, it's not neat, it happens in particular situated problem-solving environments. It's not a, you know, one-size-fits-all, go forth and publish something standard, if you like. Okay. If you then go down the other softer side of the area, it's much more about, you know, research and development is an interesting way of looking at this or framing this. Often that's focused on product development, and we're now taking that kind of thinking potentially into a new kind of space. But there's some interesting insights that they do develop in that literature. The one is absorptive capacity. In other words, what's our capability to be able to absorb new technological developments? Or would they pass us by because we don't actually do any technology or market scanning? We just don't look outside, we look internally. So they've got some interesting concepts that are used in the product development space that might actually be worth looking at in this space. What also comes out of the research sort of dimension is this idea of research questions. What are the questions that you're really trying to answer? Because in a sense that will drive down the route of, well, what data might be relevant? Do I have that data? Don't I have that data? And so on. So being clear about what questions and whether those are actually going to be answerable in terms of the data that is available. Some questions might not be. You might be better off going and talking to somebody. Maybe it's some customer insights, sort of interviews or whatever. Then there's this idea of situated learning. So who's doing the learning about performance, about trying to generate new insights. And this idea that actually they're often situated in communities of practice. And there's some interesting things there about, well, how do communities learn? And what are the kind of precepts? In other words, they come to the world with particular frames. So if you're an accountant and you look at a row of figures, you will see something very different to a marketing person looking at exactly the same set of figures. They probably wouldn't want to see figures, they might want to see something different. So it ties into some of these ideas about visualization, but it's just the clarity of which are these communities that you're bringing. If you're talking to engineers or whatever, maybe that needs to be framed differently to if you're talking to accountants. If you're trying to talk to all of them, then how do you actually package that up in a way that's meaningful for all of them? Related to that is often, if it's about learning new things, that depends to some extent on what you already know. So the question is, do you need to bring people's general knowledge about a particular topic area or whatever up to scratch to be able to really use the data that you're going to give them? So in other words, don't just think that the data is fantastic, you'll get a KPMG or whatever it is in to produce this fantastic dashboard, but actually that means that you really need a fantastic idea of, of how lean works. And if you don't understand lean, maybe you don't actually get half of the data and you don't understand the importance. So when you're doing that, the question is, well, do you actually have to do a bit of training to actually go along with rolling out this dashboard so that people really get that? Or that you can anticipate the kind of learning that's going to occur, what kind of learning path might come through. And then finally there's this idea of sense making, which is very much how do individual people make sense, and that's based on their previous experiences in the main, and again, how do they connect on which cues are relevant and so on. So that kind of thinking also tends to play into this quite neatly. So if we then look at what kind of models emerge from that, and unfortunately the third one hasn't loaded properly, there's the traditional sort of information management view of the world, actually coming from the library sciences, again a cycle. The nice contribution there in terms of the IS use is this idea that you're having to look at a whole life cycle view of data, and I think that's one of the big sort of benefits of that. What very interestingly comes out though is that most managers and IS folk understand that cycle when it's put to them. The bit they don't really understand so much is the sensing piece, which is the starting point. What is relevant? So that's the social piece, which is very much more situated and much more people dependent. It's not recognized as a concept very often, therefore probably not managed. So it's a bit serendipitous at the moment and so on. And as a result, we also don't have a handle on how best to manage that. But that's the creative piece as well very often. So just as a heads up, that seems to be coming out as both an issue and a challenge, as well as the area that's least understood. On the other side, we've got some thinking about, well, how do you get from data to information to knowledge? And some of the soft systems thinking folk who've kind of done a bit of thinking, that's partly what some of my PhD might get into as well. And this idea of data being quite different to information and knowledge, and yet we use these terms interchangeably, both within the academic community and practitioner community. Now for me there's a very distinct difference between data, which is something that can go and exist somewhere in a corner on its own, is understood differently by different people depending on whether they created the data and really understand it, whether they've got a functional discipline which is aligned, even you've got different codification and classification things. So it's very structured, and you actually need to bring a fair bit of knowledge to be able to interpret it correctly. Now that really touches on the second part, which is if you then look at the person side of it, when you're talking about information, that's something that can only exist within a person. It's the meaning that they actually attribute to data and so on. So when you start looking at things in those ways, knowledge just becomes more and more complicated meaning or complex meaning. There's a very clear divide that's occurring there between something that can exist as a resource, which needs to be managed, it needs to be stored, it needs to be backed up, and all sorts of things. Then our traditional thinking is actually much more mature in that space. But the moment you're trying to talk about insights and so on, well, actually you're talking about managing people. And that takes us into a completely different view of making sure that we don't just manage one side of that if we're really trying to get to insights. The bit that hasn't loaded is just there's some thinking there around the fact that a lot of this is iterative and cyclical. So in the data mining space, there's already a recognition there that you've got a data analyst on the one side and a business user on the other side, and they need to actually iterate and make contact quite regularly. And then again, that's a cyclical process. You know, a business person might start with a very unformed question that would actually need some refinement. They'll have a look at the data. It could be a dead end. It could actually end up throwing up more questions. So this idea of ever refinement of both the data set required, the questions that are required, that sort of idea is coming through quite strongly. What's also very interesting from that perspective is who is doing the learning. If you don't iterate and keep that contact, if you look at the marketing research, what they've found is quite a few people are now looking at why it is that marketing research isn't being used in organizations. They often get very expensive market research companies to actually go and do some market research, market insights work about customers. They come through, they tell them what they found. That may just not fit with their own internal frames, or they're not quite sure how they got to that answer, and they just don't use the insights. So market researchers feel undervalued on one level, but often there seems to be this idea of, well, you didn't bring people along on that journey of learning those iterations, which means they actually can build from a path dependency perspective on the next step to see, I can see why that answer is persuasive, because actually I can see how you got there, and I've done the learning with you, if you like. Okay, so if we then have a look at this idea of learning as being important, and learning occurring within a particular areas, then how do you encourage that kind of stuff to happen very well? And it's just this idea of recognizing that it's contextual. So who are we trying to influence? Which is the community that we're trying to work with? What problems are they trying to solve? And then, how do you get the engagement with the practitioners? If they don't understand what you're doing, if it's not driven by them, they're not going to use it. On the other hand, you need to be a bit creative, because you need to kind of imagine what you might need and then go and test that. And then also you need to focus on the right problem. So there's this idea of, you could do, in the public sector you could track anything and everything, and they often do. Versus what is the most important business problem, where you've got limited time and constrained sort of resources, where do we agree from a consensus perspective we need to spend the effort. Okay. So some tools, again, that have come through is this idea of questions, which I've touched on earlier. And a neat 2x2 that Joe and I have been working on recently is this idea of, are we clear on the question along one dimension, and do we have the data on the other dimension? So if you're doing data mining, you will have balls and balls of questions. It's the number of questions that we actually then generate using something like a business model frame, which you'll see in the bottom right. You can get posted exercises very quickly to draw down on really interesting questions. You can get voting to try and cluster which ones are more important. But before long, you then need to actually say, well, which ones are we going to look at? And if you look at the defined, undefined question, well, actually, if it's not defined, what data is going to be relevant? It feels like you might be trying to scout out for correlations and things like that and patterns. It's a different problem to actually, I know what the question is, I have the data, it's just a question of going and building a report. On the other hand, if your data is unknown or you don't have it, is that something that you can go and buy in? Is there data out there, or is this data that we need to go and invest in collecting? And there are obviously costs associated with that. Or the bottom box on the right-hand side, which is, well, we don't quite know what questions we're trying to answer yet. We don't quite know what data we want yet. But it's the kind of Google territory, which is, if there's data out there, we'll grab it. We'll figure out later what it is that we're going to do with it, but we think it's valuable just to collect that data in the meantime. That requires quite a lot of investment and potentially quite a few data links. So this is the idea of just creating a bit of a portfolio to help you prioritize which questions are going to be easy to answer and which ones do you have the data for, and what strategy do you need to kind of formulate. So you don't want to be in a situation where all your questions are in the bottom right-hand corner. So again, you want your balance in the portfolio to do the kind of quick, easy wins in the first instance, and then decide, well, how much of the other stuff do we want to do, and is that about going to get new data or invest in new data, or is this about trying to get a better handle on what it is that we're trying to establish in terms of questions? Okay. And then I think that really is kind of where we've got to in terms of certainly our thinking now from an academic perspective. So if there are any questions, I think from your side, I think we have 1 or 2 minutes left. Otherwise, I will be around the rest of this afternoon, so grab me as well.
That was great. Thank you, Martin. You've got 5 minutes left, so that's perfect. So that's good. So, questions for Martin?
what data do we have being one important dimension and the other one being, well, what is it we're really trying to find out? Are we clear on that?
And in the assessments that you talked about, people, the way to present it, have you mapped that with sort of social styles?
Sorry?
The social styles like drivers, amiable, whether they're introverted thinkers, extroverted feelers, that kind of map?
We haven't. I mean, that's very much in the cognitive space about, do people have visual preferences over audio preferences and so on. Now, even there, you can have a look at what kind of data is more readily available. And there's a lot more visual data becoming more available now, which I think is going to change what we are able to do quite significantly from the more traditional types of reporting. But we still don't see sound featuring. So if you literally go through the senses, people might have a sound bias or whatever it might be, but we don't have a neat way of actually presenting that. Now, what you might want to do is start ringing alarm bells where intolerances are, and you might want to build in some of those kind of ideas into the way things are presented. But that just feels a lot less easy than the visual. So I suspect the visualization is going to gather a lot of momentum. Some of the other things about whether there's a bad smell when you so many you can try that, and I mean, you certainly would, but I think certainly for most people, they can deal with visual, from what I understand it. So that will probably get you to quite a lot of people, if not a couple of the bases. Okay.
Looking around at sort of, I don't know, the way that people do things at the moment, have you noticed people including sort of knowledge about decisions in the BI sort of world? It's one of the things we found is lacking.
Well, it's interesting you talk about decisions, and you notice that it wasn't there at all.
Yeah.
And it's actually because a lot of the literature talks about decisions, and the way they do is that, if you actually have to summarize it, I mean, Joe's got a very neat little equation, which says, person plus data equals insight, or decision. In order to make a decision, you need a person, you need some information that they can make a decision. That's very, very grounded in thinking about deciding between different discrete options. And that's kind of where the thinking has got to. Now, the moment you don't quite know what the options are, then it's very difficult to decide what data might be relevant. In fact, the problem is different. The problem is actually working out what the options are. So there's that aspect of it. The other aspect about that equation that is dangerous is just the fact that the logic so far has been, well, we've got lots more data, so we should be getting lots better decisions. So we're concentrating a lot on producing more data, which might help decision making, but actually we're doing nothing about the other part of that equation, which is the person's ability to use that data in order to make better decisions. And that's something that Joe is trying to flag up quite a lot in his research, which is it's not quite as straightforward as that. More does not give you more. So more data doesn't automatically give you better decisions. There's something about how we use it.
I think one of the areas to think about which don't see is actually almost a record of a branch point or whatever when a decision was taken. So I'm very much in what I've seen is you don't actually see the impact of decisions in a dashboard. You see
So the way that thinking's got to is Davenport's done some work, I think, around looking at getting data about the decision-making process and the success of decisions. So looking at decision-making as a process in its own right, coming up with some metrics around that, and then monitoring that over time. Now that works very well for discrete types of decisions which you have to make often in the same way over time. So for some decisions I think that's absolutely fine. For the more exploratory types of decisions that might not work that well, because the factors are going to be unique for each decision, it's not as repeatable. But when it comes to things like diagnostics and things like that, or engineering sort of optimization decisions or whatever, where you have to do these kind of decisions often, and you build up quite a lot of data over time, yes, then absolutely that might be worth looking at. Okay. Does that?
I think so. I mean, we're looking at other angles at the moment, which are actually large numbers of discrete decisions and actually expected outcomes from those decisions.
Okay.
So whether you actually get an outcome you expected and measuring that as a reported decision making.
Right. Now, what you're then doing is you're into algorithm machine learning very often. And, that branches, and there is quite a lot of thinking about algorithmic learning, and also coming up with predictive models. So I think the key thing there is are you at a mature enough stage to know what those causal links are, to be able to model those decisions and to model those kind of outcomes. And there are people that are doing that. So if you look at the fraud example, they're very sophisticated models that the banks are now using, and they do learn. And the question there is, how do they do that, and how much personal information do you need to, or how much personal involvement do you have to try and effectively try and tweak that model all the time? Can it be left to machine learning, or do you need a person who's a really sophisticated person to try and help go to that along?
Any more questions? No? Okay, that's great. Well, certainly I found that very useful, very interesting. So just thank Martin, and